Hi, welcome to week 6C. So this is the overview video lecture for the reading list on Postcolonialism and Multiethnic Britain. Sorry, I'm getting things touching my chair and it's making noises and distracting me. So postcolonialism is one of the major trends that reshapes British literature in the latter half of the 20th century. So basically from the end of World War II on, we have a rapid sort of series of wars for colonial independence or movements for colonial independence. Sorry, that's bothering me. So the first really is 1947. India becomes an independent nation. They have the partition of India, which separates India from Pakistan, and they both become independent nations. And then starting in the 1950s, I think 1952, Ghana becomes independent in West Africa. And then throughout the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, you have nations like Nigeria, Kenya, Sierra Leone, South Africa, all becoming independent in Africa. You have Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and so on, becoming independent in the Caribbean. A number of Middle Eastern countries become independent. Nations in Southeast Asia become independent. And so most of the British Empire dissolves. I mean, the British Empire as such dissolves, and by and large, the nations that had been the British Empire become independent. Most of them join what's called the Commonwealth, which is a group of nations that function to a certain extent as sort of cultural and economic partners, but there's still strong connections between Britain and most Commonwealth countries. Also the nations that had been that had been what were called dominions, which basically had sort of rule of themselves, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the settler colonies, these become independent nations as well, but again, they maintain sort of strong ties to Britain. So mostly when we talk about post-colonial writing, we're talking about writing from Africa, India or South Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America, so sometimes East Asia. So this is really where sort of the bulk of post-colonial writing is coming from. And essentially what post-colonialism is about is attempting to determine new national identities. So part of the problem that these new nations encounter is their indigenous cultures have been fundamentally compromised by colonialism. So, for instance, if you are Nigerian, you really can't go back after like a century of British rule. You can't go back to being a Yoruba tribesperson or something like this. It simply doesn't work that way because that cultural foundation is no longer stable. You've encountered the British, you've been educated by the British, you've been shaped by British culture, and so you need to find a new, and then also so you need to find a new sort of cultural position that combines both your Yoruba traditions and your newly imposed British traditions. But then also most of the nations that are created in the post-colonial period are not necessarily created purposefully. And what I mean by that is, like, you take a nation like Nigeria, it includes multiple ethnic groups who do not necessarily, who doesn't necessarily make sense to stick in one nation. So the three big ethnic groups in Nigeria are the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Hausa. And it doesn't necessarily work well to put them all in one nation state, because historically, prior to colonialism, they were each sort of separate ethnicities, they lived in separate regions, they had different cultures, they had different practices, and things like this. But colonialism sort of draws lines on a map and says, here's Nigeria, have fun making it work, even though you're different ethnic groups with conflicting values. And that's actually one of the reasons why so many Middle Eastern countries like Iraq have such major problems, is because they have different ethnic groups stuck into national borders that aren't necessarily rooted in the history of the Middle East. And that's why, for instance, an ethnic group like the Kurds are divided between different countries like Iraq and Turkey, because they were just sort of lines drawn on a map that, again, had nothing really to do with traditional ethnic groups or where they lived or how they would organize themselves in pre-colonial society. So again, if you're Nigerian, you need to figure out how to combine your Yoruba heritage, your British culture, British education, and your new Nigerian identity in a nation state with the Igbo and the Hausa, and figure out how to construct a new identity out of this. So this is what a lot of post-colonial literature is about, is figuring out how to construct nation-state identities, or national identities, for these new political configurations that aren't necessarily rooted in pre-colonial practices. So there's negotiation with different identities and different ethnic groups within these nations, and then there's negotiation between indigenous identities and colonized identities. And this produces some of the most fascinating and beautiful writing in contemporary Anglophone literature, world Anglophone literature. Because really, when you start talking about contemporary British literature, I think I've said this in another video, when you start talking about contemporary British literature, you're talking about contemporary global Anglophone literature. So, Nigerian, Ghanaian, Jamaican, Kenyan, Indian literature in English is all something that I, as a contemporary British literature specialist, study. So, I mean, you have fantastic, incredible writers, people like Salman Rushdie from India, people like Derek Walcott from Martinique, I think. I'm going to feel stupid if that's not where he's from. He's from the Caribbean. People like Chinua Achebe of Nigeria, who's great. People like Atul Fugard of South Africa. People like I guess Nadine Gordimer is a good example of a South African writer. I don't know why I was reluctant to say Nadine Gordimer. I mean, she is a great post-colonial writer. I fully endorse Nadine Gordimer, despite my inexplicable hesitation there. So, but I mean, my point is that you have these great people who are writing these novels, plays, poems, stories, etc., etc., trying to figure out their new national identity and how to come to terms with these competing forces shaping identity. The other component of this reading list is that you have a massive amount of immigration into Great Britain from former colonies, really starting in the 50s. So you have people coming in from India and Pakistan, you have people coming in from West Africa, South Africa, you have people coming in from the Caribbean, and then you have people also from these places going to Canada, going to Australia, and so on and so on. And these are historically very white-dominated areas. And so all of a sudden you have Africans, you have South Asians, you have Afro-Caribbeans coming in, bringing their own culture, bringing their own dialects, their own music, their own food, and bringing dark skin to nations, to areas that are historically very Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Celtic. And so in the 50s, really, we have sort of the emergence of a major new trend in British culture, which is racism. So there have been long trends of sort of anti-Celtic racism against Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, but we have the emergence of anti-Indian, anti-Pakistani, anti-African, anti-Caribbean, whatever it is, racism, which is directed basically against people with dark skin. And this is a major problem. And this racism sort of comes to inform British culture in ways that are actually fairly similar to the ways that they informed, say, Jim Crow era U.S. culture. But this sort of experience of the immigrants, this experience of displacement, and again, this is very similar to what happened in the U.S., this experience of displacement and this experience of feeling unwelcome in a new country, and really in a country to which you sort of feel that you should be welcomed. This produces some of the most fantastic art in contemporary British literature, or contemporary British culture. So, I mean, you have people who are writing about the immigrant experience and about what it's like to come to Britain and to either feel alienated or to feel like you're losing your culture or to struggle to find a new sort of place in British society. Grace Nichols, whom we read last week, is a great example of this. The Soyinka poem that we're going to read this week, Telephone Conversation, is another great example of this. The sort of struggle to find a place in a society that's not necessarily ready to have you in it. So these immigrant voices, post-colonial voices from what had been the fringes of the British Empire, helped to revitalize and re-energize British literature, global Anglophone literature, as they struggle to identify their own place in the sphere of British culture.